What's up, everybody? Welcome to Undisciplined by Design. This is a show where we talk with innovation leaders from across the country about their approaches to driving innovation and creating the future. Today, we're talking with Lyn Jeffrey. She's a futurist and cultural anthropologist with Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley. Today, Lyn will talk with us about the importance of infusing futures thinking into your innovation practices and watching for signals of change. So let's dive in and see what's next. All right, well, hey, Lyn, thanks for having us today here. We're in Palo Alto. We're at Institute for the Future's new offices, and I always love to talk about Institute for the Future for lots of reasons, but one of the things that's always fun is when I have to say to them, which is a real place. Institute for the Future is not something I made up. This is a real place, right? I don't know if you deal with that or not, but we're excited to be here today to kind of talk about Foresight as a practice. You all are obviously leaders in that, and I know that you're on the front lines of making Foresight more accessible to larger audiences. So let's hear a little bit about what IFTF is and does, and a little bit about your background too.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So Institute for the Future has been around since 1968, and we actually came out of the RAND Corporation. We had a number of our founders who were computer scientists, mostly computer scientists, working at RAND on the early internet technology. And they were using what was at that time sort of government strategic foresight practices, mostly done with the military, but also got different kinds of planning. And they could see, even though it was the late 60s and we didn't have anything like the internet, they could sort of see where the technology was going and start to imagine what mass connectivity might look like. And so they left RAND and founded the Institute as a public-facing nonprofit group to try to take the methods that they were using and bring those to the public and help other people do what they were doing to anticipate what they rightly saw as this kind of rolling, decades-long transformation of society and business and economy. And so that's how we were founded. And it's really still what we do, which is to try to help people anticipate what's coming so that they can avoid the things that they don't want and build toward the things that they do. We do a lot of kind of strategic research to help people figure out the future of whatever's important to them. We do a lot of community-based foresight, and then we do a lot of teaching and training and helping people get better at doing this stuff themselves. My background is I'm a cultural anthropologist. Spent a couple of decades in China and came to the Institute almost 25 years ago. And I do a lot of research, and I also do a lot of helping different kinds of organizations figure out what is foresight, why might I use it, and then how do I actually start practicing it?
Well, okay, with that in mind, I think there's something interesting you talked about the origins here in the military. And given that, some of our listeners and viewers may not really even understand what foresight is, which is part of why we're so excited to have this conversation today, how, for example, did the military use what is now being used as foresight across these various, applications that then led to them saying we should apply this elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think that RAND, honestly, I don't know the deep history of the RAND Corporation. My understanding is that it was working across the government, so it wasn't just military. But ARPANET was, I think, funded by the Department of Defense. So all of the internet technology that we have now, a lot of the space technology came out originally of defense spending and defense research. And as part of that, they would do these long-range planning exercises when you're making the investment at that scale. The other place that we often see foresight coming from was from fossil fuel companies. So oil companies, of course, are classic. Again, organizations and institutions that are making huge bets and are trying to think ahead, building infrastructure that's going to, be rolled out over decades sometimes. So those were the kinds of places where a lot of these techniques were developed. So then the folks who founded the Institute for the Future, it was 1968. You had a lot going on in society, a lot of change happening. Alvin Toffler, it was kind of a big futures moment in the United States, at least, and probably around the world. You had student movements around the world. And I think there was just a sense that they wanted to do something that was more public-facing, and they really felt they were quite prescient. They could see that this eventually starting to connect people to talk to each other across time and space through the internet would have really profound implications on everything that we do.
Yeah.
So really it was their vision as futurists that prompted them with a grant from the Ford Foundation to leave RAND and then start something like the Institute.
Okay. I think that, and I didn't know all of that history, so first of all, it's just fun to hear it. But I also think that's really helpful to sort of explain the field.
Yeah.
A lot of times we think about, you're a cultural anthropologist. The field of anthropology has existed since long before any of us in this room. You know, the same thing with engineering or astronomy, right? And so you can grasp those things as a field with an evolution. But something that really started to become mainstream in the 1960s, on the one hand, can look at it and say, wow, this is very relevant and timely, but also to track back, like, okay, did somebody just make this up? You know, how'd you guys come up with this? I think it's really helpful to know that it came from these places where you're making long bets. A lot of times I'll describe Foresight as looking more at like the tectonic shifts as opposed to even the earthquake itself, right? There's these massive plates that are moving around that then manifest in an earthquake. And you have to think at that scale when you're an oil company or a government, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So thinking about what you all do today, I know that you run a lot of workshops and trainings and things like that. I'm sure there's different people that come to you for different reasons. Our program, the program that I lead, and a lot of this podcast is about just innovation. We call it innovation and future creation sometimes because innovation can drive what the future looks like. Are there some ways that you've seen the sort of the overlap, or you've seen that Foresight has really empowered innovation?
Yeah, so we work with, one of the interesting things about Foresight as a practice, which is much broader than that original set of techniques that came out of Rand Corporation and Shell Oil, and it's much, much broader today. But one of the things that I love about it is that you can apply it almost anywhere. You can apply it for marketing and insights to try to understand what's happening with people on the ground. You can apply it to human resources and thinking about workforce planning. You can apply it to facilities. You can apply it, of course, to strategic planning, and then to design and innovation. And so we have a lot of people. I would say the demand for our services comes mostly from strategy and innovation. And for innovation, that would be people who are, I mean, it's the classic question, how do we continue to evolve, how we create new value? And as the world changes around us, can we come up with some new tools and processes that help us do that? So I think that people often use foresight and innovation in a couple different ways. They use it to help spark imagination, always important, also a core part of design thinking is what we call kind of futures imagination, future-back thinking, kind of how do you train your imagination and your mind to think better about the future. It's also to help people really get hands-on practice, building the future, building things that might impact the future. And so we work with a lot of design teams and innovation teams, people who are designing an innovation sprints. How can they add a foresight layer to that to expand what they're doing? So one example that we're working on right now is with a very large school district here in California. It's a K-12 school district. They serve, I think, maybe 50,000 students, so a lot of students. And if you know anything about education, you know that there's a lot of challenges in the education systems right now. There's nothing new there. The fact that there's huge challenges is not new, but they have this ongoing problem of how do we engage our faculty, our staff, our communities to not just be overwhelmed by what's happening in the present, but think about the future in new ways and have different conversations about the future so that we can innovate. So what they've done is they've had all these challenges around they have a lot of immigrants in their system, so they have certain challenges. They have funding challenges. They have AI coming online and trying to think about that. One of the interesting things that's happening in many school systems is a radical increase in absenteeism, especially for high school students, which I think a lot of people don't know. But right now in California, for high school seniors, a quarter to a third of them are chronically absent for the entire year of their senior year. Wow. So kids, after the pandemic, a lot of older kids especially just didn't re-engage with school. So there's a huge challenge space. And then how this particular district encountered Foresight and decided that they would start to reorganize their innovation practice around this idea of thinking about the future.
Okay.
So they've brought together this 50-person innovation collaborative, and they're basically training themselves how to notice what's happening in the world around them, how to push their thinking toward the future, and then with this rather large collective conversation, develop new pilots and new ways of innovating. And it's completely unlike anything that they've ever had at the school level. And it just speaks to a new approach to kind of solving some ongoing, really, really tough challenges.
Yeah, I think especially in that system, it's a good one to think about with this because there has been a trend towards it just being harder and harder for public schools for years. So the conversation, you mentioned changing the conversation. The conversation often really is just complaining about how difficult it's getting and sharing stories. And I think, I was actually a public school teacher at the beginning of my career for about 5-6 years. And I do think that, there's a cathartic feeling about just complaining with your fellow teachers about, look at the system we're in and look at how this is breaking and this is breaking. But that doesn't really help get you towards a better future. It might help you feel better in the moment. So that's a very good way to systematically approach making actual change in that system.
And it's slow. These kinds of changes are slow. But one of the superintendents actually told us recently that, they're in the process of doing this. She said, we're still putting out fires. Most of our job is still putting out fires. But now we are able to think about the longer term consequences of the decisions we're making to put out those fires.
Okay.
So basically, they've started to build they've expanded their own strategic horizons. And in a meaningful way that comes and plays into their work every day. And really that's what we're trying to do at the Institute, is helping different kinds of people see the future and bring it into the present.
Yeah. I think that's that puts a nice exclamation point on the idea of foresight and being a futurist, or thinking about the future even, doesn't have to be this esoteric thing that feels out there for only a certain elite group of people who would identify as futurists. You're just helping everyday people who are trying to do the best they can in their job make decisions that have a different time horizon or have an awareness of more things going on around them. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, there's something else interesting in that I think would be fun to kind of talk about. You mentioned, actually, this whole conversation is mostly about long-term, larger changes, but you mentioned layering this lens onto something like a design or innovation sprint. That feels like that could be in conflict, but obviously there's some value in probably doing that too. So how, in contrast to thinking about a long play, does it maybe look to say, okay, maybe it's even just a half day, or maybe I got 2 days with a group that would normally be doing an innovation sprint, and we want to layer this foresight, futures thinking lens onto it?
So I recently actually taught a class to a large architectural firm, a global architectural firm, where we're trying to help their partners bring foresight and futures thinking into their practice. Okay. So these are very senior people who are involved in designing and building some of the largest installations and buildings in the world. And so they have their processes very set. They know what they do, they're experts at it, and they have a certain business model which involves spending certain amounts of time on different parts of the process. Okay. Yeah. And so then you come in as a foresight practitioner and you say, oh, you should add futures to what you do. And on one hand, you could imagine adding a few months onto your normal process. If you want to really get deeply into creating your own visions of the future and doing a lot of research, although that is changing with AI as well, the amount of time you can get a lot further much more quickly. Yeah. So then the question always becomes, how do we bring some sense of the future into a design or innovation process, and when do we do that and why? And what's really the value of doing that? And one of the interesting things that came out of the conversations in that class was oftentimes designers are looking for solutions. They want to jump right to solutions. And when you try to bring futures in at the beginning, the fuzzy front end of the process, it really is not meant to be something that is going to lead you directly to a design solution. It is much more meant to be a space for imagining possibilities. And so you have to, it is a different way of thinking. Even if you had an hour to do it, it would be enough. If you have a few hours to do it, even better. But making sure that you design into your process a time, a place, a way to bring in some what we call signals of change that help you understand what's changing, drivers of change. Of course, a lot of people use trends research as well. But having that time to think about possibilities without attaching them to specific design solutions, because a lot of the things that we imagine when we're doing futures work, they're probably not going to happen that way. Because we're not doing predictions. We're not saying this is going to happen or this definitely isn't going to happen. We're saying these 3 or 4 things might happen, and if they did happen, what should we be thinking about? So I think it's even less about time. It's more about giving yourself that mental space at the beginning of whatever kind of innovation process you have. And then, of course, there are lots of simple ways that you can do that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I love that example, too, because, building a building or planning a community is not something that you just do like that.
Right.
And so bringing it into the design of something that hopefully will be around for a long time, right? Or a community that you're building for a long time just makes a lot of sense. I also think the place that you're talking about putting it makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot in the program that I lead about using design thinking and human-centered design and, front-loading a lot of that time to just allow yourself to explore. That's a very natural place when you're doing divergent thinking. Very natural place to put this kind of thinking, to where you don't necessarily just have to say, what are all the weird, fun things we could do with this product? You could say, what are the weird, fun ways that the world might be changing? Exactly.
And especially when you're doing user-centered research, I think one of the things futures thinking and Foresight can offer is helping you think at a more systems level, kind of an outside-in view of how the world is changing around people and how that's likely to change over the next, we like to take a decade out. So, when you push your thinking out 10 years, it allows you to really think through unfolding implications of things that are happening today. And it doesn't mean that you're planning for 2035. It means you're getting a big picture view of what the next decade would look like in order to take near-term and mid-term actions. But that more expansive sense of the future, we think, presents a more expansive sense of the present.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I really like that. And you used a couple of words there that I'm familiar with, but I think are good to stop and unpack too. Sort of this idea of signals.
Yes.
Let's talk about what a signal is at a very practical level.
So there's some really great books written about this. Amy Webb has a whole book about signals of change. And I guess in any field, people use terms in different ways. So the Institute, we have our own ways of talking about it. There is, of course, a whole academic field of future studies. There are multiple academic futures and foresight journals. That's less the space that the Institute plays in. We're kind of in between practice and academia. And so the way that we talk about signals is maybe not, it could be slightly different than the way some others do. But for us, a signal of change is a real thing that's happening in the world that is disrupting the status quo in some way. So you notice it because something's different about it. You may not even know why. You may not even know what's behind it. But it's something that actually strikes your imagination so it might be something that you see walking through the airport. I saw an ad in an airport the other day, which was an ad for an AI company, and it said, AI workers never get tired, or something like that. AI workers will never come to you and complain about work-life balance. And it was an ad for a company that was trying to sell this concept of digital workers or digital employees. So that's a real ad, and it's a real company. And that was a signal of change. I noticed it because I was, it surprised me. So signals are things that surprise you. You could come across them in your everyday life. You often come across them more intentionally through doing research. And what surprises me is maybe different than what surprises you. So the other great thing about signals is it's a really good way to have a group of people share what they're noticing about how the world's changing from their perspective and their context. And then you get a much wider, more sensitive view than if you're just doing it by yourself.
Okay.
Is that kind of a jive with what you think of as a signal?
Yeah, and I actually really like the way that that you're defining. It could be as simple as something you see, an advertisement for something that feels a little bit out there, like nobody else is talking about that. I don't see other advertisements like that. Or it could be interviewing a group of people and noticing a pattern across what they say.
Yes.
Or it could be reading an article with a really provocative main idea or headline.
Yes.
So signals aren't limited to the foresight practice and knowing how to do the research. A person can very accessibly be scanning, keeping their eyes open, and just be thoughtful and aware of where there might be signals everywhere.
Exactly. And then what we like to do, and this is what we do pretty much all day at the Institute, is we sense what's changing around us, and then if we find something really interesting, we would just start to interrogate it. Just ask a couple of questions, like what are the larger shifts that are behind this signal? What are we moving from? What are we moving toward? So that signal that I just that I shared, for example, we're moving from employees as people to employees as humans. We're moving from thinking of software as a machine to thinking of software in kind of like in a human way. And there are a lot of from-to shifts that could be going on. So we start to ask those kinds of questions. And then we also like to ask, if this signal became the norm in the future, how would the world be different? And so you start to embed that kind of thinking and those kinds of questions, and then you start noticing what you're noticing. So, there's a signal. Oh, I just noticed a signal of change. Now let me think about it a little bit and push my own thinking out to the future. And that's how you start to build your own sense of how the future could be different.
Yeah.
So to circle back to what you asked about how you might use foresight in a kind of whatever innovation or design process you're already using, you could simply have people start collecting signals. It's not that easy, actually, to find a good signal. So, especially on demand, like you have to kind of prime your mind for it. You have to be looking for them. You have to be noticing what you're noticing, and then you have to start to develop insight and foresight from the signal. And then you're doing that with lots of signals. And so, even having a group of people collect the signals that they see that are truly surprising to them. So you don't want someone coming in and saying, to me, for example, the chronic absenteeism data point is a really interesting signal of change. I mentioned it earlier that 1/4 to 1/3 of California seniors are chronically absent, senior high school students.
Yeah.
To a teacher, that's not going to be a signal of change at all. So then if you were to, in your innovation process, ask your team to collect signals that were truly interesting to them, you're really going to start to see things that you wouldn't see. And hopefully that would bring you to some new directions that you hadn't seen if you had, for example, done your traditional design process or innovation process.
Yeah. That's really good. No, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. There's something you said there, too, that I think is worth calling out, is the difference between a prediction and a forecast.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think it is easy I hear this even with people who I've explained that foresight is not about predicting the future.
Yeah.
Still ask, like, okay, so what are your predictions for this, right? I think it's natural to do that, but the language is important and the way you talk about it. So. Yeah,
it's funny because I feel sometimes like people might think it's kind of a cop-out, like, you kind of are making predictions, but you're saying that you're not, so that no one has to hold you accountable or something like that. But it is important because it's a different way of thinking about what you're doing. If you think about what you're doing as making predictions, then really the conversation becomes, were you right or were you wrong? Okay. And that's not a very interesting place to develop insight and action from. If you are creating something which is about plausible because it's based on evidence,
Okay.
and provocative visions, stories, narratives, artifacts from the future. That's what you're doing, and they're possibilities. It's a possibility space to imagine what could be, which is really, the only thing that we think is much more effective than trying to get something right. Yeah. And if you're trying to get something right, you're probably not going to give yourself the space to imagine all the things that could be.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've been thinking back to we kind of got to the end of our semester and academic year recently, and so it was a good opportunity to share in various formats with different audiences. Here's just some highlights of things from our work this year. And one of the things that I tried to be really careful to call out is, it's not about predicting the future.
Right.
It's about preparing to thrive in any possible future.
Right.
And again, could feel like a cop-out, but I think it does help. It helps explain why this is a practice that you would want to infuse into a design sprint or into your long-term strategic plan. It's because we're not going to be able to place the right bets every time.
Yeah, and I think the other way I have found myself talking about it recently is it's kind of wrestling with uncertainty. There's so much uncertainty right now. I've been doing this for almost 25 years, and when I first got into this, I was an anthropologist. I knew a lot about China and socialism and capitalism and all of these kind of academic things. And all of a sudden I was being asked to think about phones and, blogging and all these things that were happening at that time, which, believe it or not, felt like things were changing so quickly. It was pre-social media, it was pre-smartphone. Even at that time, we were blown away by this thing called the internet and the World Wide Web. Yeah. Which I think is probably hard for a lot of younger people to imagine. That felt like the pace of change was really fast. Now, I have to say that the pace of change, especially with AI and especially with just all the changes that are happening externally right now, we're really in a place of kind of acute uncertainty. And we've had a lot of radical change introduced into our environment pretty quickly, I would say, in the last couple of years with the pandemic. And so it feels even more important than ever to say, you have to consider the different possibilities because you cannot know which way things are going. Yeah. So I think the practice is even more valuable than ever, and I think that's why more and more people are coming to it and trying to add it to what they do. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. It's like you had a head start on thinking in this kind of way, which is an advantage in times where things are changing quickly.
Yes.
So everyone's being affected by it.
Yes.
But if you're already primed to be thinking about how there are always multiple possible futures, you're not as likely to be completely blindsided by rapid change. So a lot of these examples have been spread across lots of different industries, and I think that's a great thing because that shows how approachable and important this work is. It's also not limited to a specific set of skills or people. Maybe there are probably certain skills and mindsets that are helpful for foresight, but you don't have to come from a specific discipline or get a degree in foresight. Being a cultural anthropologist probably really does help you think about people and how people interact. But someone doesn't have to be an anthropologist to do this either. And I'm sure that you've got some good examples of how the multidisciplinary, or in my work we talk about transdisciplinary even, where like we don't want you to define yourself by your major or your discipline. We want you to find yourself as a thinker who's creative and open and curious, right? Have you seen that in the work that IFTF does as well?
Definitely, yeah. We have, I think I'm one of the only anthropologists, right? But generally we have had on staff people who have policy backgrounds or economic or development backgrounds. We've had lawyers. We've had, of course, technologists. We've had filmmakers. There's a lot of different. As I was saying, I think when we started, just like you can apply foresight almost anywhere in an organization. Anyone can start to learn and develop this for their field. Part of it is a way of thinking. Part of it is training yourself to start noticing what's changing and pushing your own thinking toward the future. Part of it is adding foresight processes to whatever your workflow is, no matter who you are or what you do. And it is, it's very much about systems thinking. So, anyone who sits anywhere within an ecosystem could be thinking more broadly outside in, what's changing in their field. So I think it is, you don't need to be a specific kind of person to be doing futures and foresight. Yeah.
Well, that's probably a good spot for us to kind of wrap it up and put a bow on it, right? I think people, I hope that you had fun getting to kind of unpack it. I know you teach this stuff every day, so it might be easy to kind of think like, oh yeah, we'll talk about foresight again. But I think that this is going to reach a new audience. So I'm really excited that we had a chance to showcase this. I know I really enjoyed doing the Foresight Essentials class with you all this last year, and I enjoyed being there in person and doing it in immersive ways.
Right.
So thanks for hosting us and letting us be here, and I'm glad we had a chance to help share your story.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I love what you're doing, so keep it up. Yeah.